very much for the introduction. Hope everybody hears me okay and you see the slides okay. How do they look on your side, Joe?
They look good, Steve, and you sound good, so I think we can get going.
Thanks to everybody for your time and attention today. I know your time's important. My goal is to try to keep you off your email and your cell phone for about an hour. We'll talk about safety and security in the library environment, and a lot of this is based on my work, having done this type of presentation for the last 16 or 17 years for libraries around the country and primarily in California where I am. The publication of my book for ALA Library Security came out in June. The book has done very well and they're very pleased about it, and I'm super happy about the concept of bringing this to you today as a repeat performance. The slides are posted on the website for Rails, and thanks to Rails and to Joe for his time and support. I did a couple of things recently which are coming up. One is I did an interview with the Library Journal, which is a supplement to a Library Journal interview that I did back in October. The October piece is a large one and a full page. I was really happy about that, to talk about library security in a Q&A format. I just did a new Library Journal interview, which should be coming out, I think, next month on library security and focusing on some issues which we'll be talking about today. And also I did, ALA has a new podcast which is starting up, and I just did an interview for them, and that should be out in a few weeks as well. So if you're connected to ALA in terms of some of their outreach, the podcast will be coming out with me pretty soon. So to my Chicago friends out there, go Cubs and go White Sox. Both of your teams are pretty dominant in baseball right now, so good for you. One of the things I got from my conversation with the Library Journal interviewer and also with the ALA podcast folks was, what is the biggest security question facing libraries today, and has that changed or evolved? And really, think about this for your own perspective. What is the main things that you're dealing with? Tends to be the things that I see over and over again when I go to libraries around the country to teach my half-day program. Really, it is the mentally ill, the homeless, and if we're really lucky, the mentally ill that are also homeless, and if we're really lucky, the trio, which is substance abusing, mentally ill, homeless people. And then the second one that I seem to see a lot of recently is the entitled patron. The entitled patron may be angry or entitled or threatening. It could be just a normal citizen that just has this sense of entitlement. But what I notice is, and I talk to staff about this, is they tend to dominate the day. And so 5% of that type of patron can dominate 80% of your day. And what I notice is sometimes staff feels bullied by these types of patrons. They feel intimidated by these types of patrons. Sometimes they don't feel like they have the right to say no to these types of patrons. So we'll talk about that as we go forward. So a small number, and this is the security trend I'm typically seeing, the small number of entitled, angry, I pay your salary kind of patrons tends to dominate the landscape in some libraries. And if you have some of those folks that come into your facility, you know what I'm talking about. One of the things that we have for you today, and through Joe and his magical wizardry at the keyboard, is some poll questions. And Joe, if we could put those up.
You bet. Okay, so in a moment, folks, you should get the first poll question. And for those that are, if anybody called in and not viewing, I'll just read it. In terms of response time and visibility, I would define our relationship with local law enforcement as excellent, good, we never see them, poor. So just take a minute to put in your responses, and then I'll actually read again for the benefit of those that maybe aren't watching but just listening. So it looks like just over half of you are saying that your relationship is good, about 58%. Then we got 27% excellent, and 10% we never see them, and 7 or 8% poor. So it looks like that is what we're seeing for those. Do you want me to do the other two now, Steve, or hold off?
Yeah, let me comment on that one, Joe, just for a second.
Yeah.
Thanks for answering the poll question. What I see in my perfect library world, and I talk about this in my training and in this webinar, what does the perfect library world look like? Do we have a relationship with local law enforcement, either sheriff's deputies or police officers that come through your facility on an irregular basis, maybe once a week or a couple times a week or once every few weeks, just to come in, say hello, get a cup of coffee, maybe use the bathroom in the back? That's what most cops want, is a safe bathroom. When I was in the cops, that's all I cared about. And the idea that we have an ongoing relationship with them where they can come in and sort of get an eyeball on the landscape, see patrons, see problematic people, talk to problematic patrons, and sort of show the flag. And what I notice sometimes, and I'm glad to see that at least 50% of you have a good relationship, is many library folks tell me they rarely see the police. If they come, it's only because they're called, and typically only for a crime of violence. I get the fact that the police departments around the country are shorthanded. When I left the PD in 2000, we had 2,000 cops. Now we have 1,600 in San Diego. So I'm aware of that issue. But in my perfect library world, there'd be a better connection to your police department. And I think that starts with a call to the watch commander to say, hey, can you send the person, the beat deputy or the beat officer who has this area of responsibility over to us so we can introduce ourselves and just start a relationship and a conversation and point out some of the things we may need some help. And so what I would like to see is more interaction with your local PD and sheriffs for the cities and counties to come in on an irregular basis and just be more visible. Joe, the next question.
You bet. Okay, so a true-false question. I am aware of the public and private homeless advocacy groups in my community. Again, a true and false. So take a moment and answer that to the best of your ability. I'll give you another 10 seconds to do that, and then I'll push out the responses. Okay, and it's looking like about roughly 2/3 of you are answering true, and yeah, 69% true, 31% false.
So great answers there, and the issue in that question is, do you understand, and it sounds like many of you do, that you have both the public sector organizations, which could be county mental health and county social services and county homeless advocacy, which is connected to the political operations in your county, but also the private sector groups, which could be the Catholic Charities and St. Vincent de Paul and Salvation Army, where you can get meetings going with these folks on the public and private side to start bringing in the stakeholders and say, look, this high-risk population that comes into our library is also a high-risk population for you, for our cities and counties. And since you work with this group on a regular basis, can you share some of your best practices with us? And I mentioned this in the book quite a lot, which is, how do you start those liaison conversations and liaison relationships? It can take a while to get the meeting scheduled, to get people to show up for the meetings, to follow up for the meetings, and to start that conversation about how to deal with that high-risk population. So thanks for your answers on that. One of the things I think about as I look at the library environment in my little town in San Diego, we've got a library being built, and it should be open for business, I think, in the fall, so they're swinging hammers as we speak to replace the current library, is how the library is perceived by not only the employees, but also perceived by the taxpayers and the people that visit them. So we're always having this dialogue about what we can do to stimulate conversations about the library in cities and counties, what we can do to stimulate people coming in and using the facilities, and really creating that next generation of library users. And from the safety and security perspective, the things that I tend to see on my work, which is kind of typically the dark side, is the entitled or angry patron who typically misses the old library, where it was quiet, where there was respect for the staff, where there was not a lot of eating and coffee and cell phones and laptops and things like that. They certainly miss the card catalog. And then there's a collection of newer patrons who sort of feel like the library is open season. They can do whatever they want. They don't care about our code of conduct, which I think is critical. The code of conduct for your facility is an ongoing, adaptable, flexible document that you're always trying to fine-tune or tighten up a little bit. Don't care about the rules. Don't care about what policies we're trying to enforce in terms of safe use of the library. Certainly, times are stressful for library staffs. We're still seeing the same thing across the country, which is cut the staff, cut the hours, move towards a skeleton crew for some of the facilities. I see this a lot, especially in rural libraries where we may have 1 or 2 people in a fairly large facility, and they're out by themselves out in the country somewhere, and not a lot of access or help. And then the idea that because of the pace of society these days, we're in kind of a 72,000-mile-an-hour world. What is the response by the staff is they've got to do more with less and faster than ever before, and maybe less resources, less help, and less money. So the 24/7 world seems sort of leisurely. I talk to my psychology friends, and they suggest that we're now in a 72.7 world, which is just 1,000 miles an hour. I really talk to somebody who doesn't own a cell phone. When you see the idea of the technology that's taken over our world, inside the library and outside of it, we also can agree that for all the value of technology, it certainly creates stress, and the stress it creates in not only library staff but in patrons as well. They expect patrons, of course, that all the technology in the library works perfectly with no flaws at all. So how come I can't log on? Why can't I use your server for my iPad, that type of thing. So we see some of that technology stress coming into the library environment as well. So 3 things I want to talk about specifically in my discussion today. These are what I really put into the library security book as the central themes as well, which is the need for posted codes of conduct. I see the idea that the code of conduct is on the website only for your library system, or it's on a clipboard hiding behind the circulation desk. And in my perfect library world, we'd be able to see the posted library code of conduct on a poster that you could read from outer space. It would be in multiple rooms. It would be 6 to 8 to 10 ideas which are written in a positive way rather than in a negative way. Instead of "don't eat in the library," "please enjoy your food and beverage outside," "no cell phone calls in libraries," please take your conversations outside. Those types of shifts that we see in the code of conduct language. And what I typically see in libraries, especially where the county council has come in and waved their magic legal hand over things, they typically make the language in code of conduct sound quite legalistic and oftentimes a little bit negative. And I'm thinking that in a staff meeting, in a conversation with your peers and the leadership team, you can soften the edges of the code of conduct sometimes when it comes out sounding like a legal document, and make it something that people actually can understand, especially folks that don't speak English as their first language. It's readable, it's understandable, it's inviting, instead of being a list of sort of prison camp rules that some of them kind of turn into. The second thing is with the staff, and especially if you're in a leadership supervisory position, is how do you create an environment where the staff feels comfortable enforcing code of conduct, staff feels comfortable enforcing security and safety policies, and they can do it in a way that addresses these 4 issues. They're firm, they're fair, they're consistent, and they're assertive. I know that I'm a introvert trapped in an extrovert's profession. Dig Steve for an hour. I stand in front of total strangers and talk all day long, but I'm an introvert. And so when I'm an extrovert situationally, that means I have to turn it on. It's like acting in a play. It's like being out of my comfort zone for that span of time. I know sometimes library employees feel the same way, which is I'd rather not confront certain behaviors. And I understand that. And the message I always say is, what is it that this person is doing that hurts the business? And that's really my crossroads thought process for anybody in the patron staff interaction, which is, what is this person doing that hurts the business of the library? If the guy's a homeless guy sleeping in the corner, he's not bugging anybody, I say leave him alone. If the guy's aggressively panhandling or pestering other patrons or bringing in 53 bags of stuff and his comfort scorpion or his comfort rattlesnake, we have to address those concerns. And so that's really kind of the watchword that I use, which is, what is the impact on the business? And then the last one is, how are we creative and assertive and fair and firm and consistent in our customer service skills, which is, how do we deal with the entitled patron, the angry patron? How do we deal with those patrons who are problematic? And really the language that we use, I think, is quite interesting too. When I first started teaching these programs way back about 17 years ago, I was sort of under the usual impression, as somebody that didn't come from library world, as calling the patrons difficult. And over the years, I've evolved my thinking with help from a lot of very thoughtful and helpful librarians, which is, let's call them challenging patrons. And what they do is a challenge to our customer service skills. What they do is a challenge to our information handling skills. What they do is in terms of their behavior, is a challenge to our codes of conduct. So challenging patrons may not be threatening or violent, certainly, but they can be difficult, they can be problematic, they can be entitled, they can be angry, they can be eccentric. And you know this from your experience, we can't always pick our customers. We have kind of a trap relationship with them. They come into our facilities, we do the best we can with them, but we can't necessarily fire our customers because we have this kind of inviting relationship where they come into use our facilities. But we do certainly, as the shepherds of those buildings, have the ability to set policy and to enforce consequences, and without consequences, we're going to see the behavior is going to escalate or stay the same. So these things are all part of this trio of the themes I'm going to talk about today. Good code of conduct, firm, fair, and consistent and assertive approaches by staff, where staff feels comfortable asking for help, which is not a sense that they can't do their jobs successfully. Asking for help should not be a sin in your library. Changing the ratios of confrontation by bringing over a coworker or a supervisor to help with the situation should not be perceived as a sin. And the idea of creative customer service skills, which is focused in my area of the safety piece and the security piece, which is how do you do your job safely and still provide good customer service. Three kind of themes to our conversation today. One is the idea of staff being able to protect themselves from harm. The concept of physical assault is kind of rare in libraries, but I want staff to feel like, and I say this in training, that they're not supposed to stand there and be assaulted. I would rather that they not get into a fight, certainly. I would rather that they not cause a confrontation, but they have the right to protect themselves, and one way to protect themselves is to be smarter than the assaultive, threatening patron. Get out of there, disengage, disconnect from that situation. The other is to use proxemic barriers, space and distance barriers that we have in the library world, like counters and desks and things like that, and physically move out of harm's way. And then the third idea of self-protection is to not only change the ratios of confrontation with staff, but bring in the police or the sheriff's department and have code words set up in place where staff can go and call the police or call the sheriff's department from a safe location and get them en route. The second part is managing stress and anger. And I think it's critical, especially when we have a high human contact job where you deal with people all day long as part of your work, and you're in a transactional job where you deal with people who range from very cooperative and very nice to, outrageous and big jerks, is that you're able to manage your stress and anger. And a lot of my customer service colleagues that teach customer service exclusively talk about Q-tip, which stands, of course, for quit taking it personally. It's easy sometimes in your library environment to be personally offended when people are rude to you, or personally offended when people are not following our rules, or personally offended when they are disrespectful of you or the other staff members in the library. I think sometimes taking it personally, we lose objectivity, we lose focus, and sometimes it's difficult to keep our head in the game. And so I remind people in the training environment, look, it's not about you. They're not angry at you personally, they're angry at what you represent. Most of the time their issues are their own in terms of their failure to pay fees and fines or that type of, not your issue. So managing stress and anger is simply boiled down to one common practice, which is managing your breathing. And so I tell people in the training environment all the time, slow down your breathing. Slow down the way you breathe, drop your pulse rate, keep your blood pressure down, keep your head in the game. It's easy sometimes when dealing with confrontive, threatening, angry people to start to breathe short and shallow. You get into that kind of fight or flight modality. You can feel that queasiness in your stomach or your hands start to shake. Oftentimes in that scenario too, we get into fight or flight, which means the blood leaves our head, our brains, and goes into our arms and legs. We get tunnel vision, we get tunnel hearing, we don't come up with the best answers, we don't come up with the best solutions because we're a little freaked out by the situation. You can control that successfully and safely by just slowing down your breathing. So I'm constantly telling people, slow down your breathing over the telephone when you're dealing with an irate patron. Slow down your breathing when you're dealing with a problematic person in the library. Slow down your breathing in situations where you need your best judgment, where you need good customer service skills so you can keep your head in the game. And the last theme, of course, is to work smart. Change the ratios of confrontation. Bring over other people. You ever had someone come over and say the exact same thing you just said, or have a supervisor come over and say the exact same thing you just said, and the person complies? Sometimes we have good alignment with patrons, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we connect well with certain people based on our history. It could be based on race or age or gender. We have a connection with this person, or our colleague does, and we don't, or vice versa. Trade off. Use the concept of alignment to say who's the best person to talk to this person who's typically problematic. And working smart is getting the police or the sheriff's department if necessary. Working smart is disengaging for scary or dangerous people. Working smart is using proxemic barriers, desks, countertops. The telephone's a great proxemic barrier. Don't come down here, sir. We'll email you what you need. So working smart is the staff member's ability to do his or her job, not just doing their job, but doing their job safely. One of the things that we see in the post-Columbine, post-9/11, post-San Bernardino incident world, post-Virginia Tech and some of these major shootings is the news media's obsessive focus on profiles. And I'm really into behaviors. And I don't care what people look like. I only care about what they do. And so the model for me in your facility in terms of addressing problematic patron behavior is not what they look like. We're not profiling them based on age or race or anything else like that. We're looking at behaviors. Do these behaviors hurt the library? Does this behavior this person's doing impact other people, including staff, in a negative way, in which case we address it firmly, fairly, consistently, and assertively. What's the goal in the library? Peace or justice? The answer, of course, is peace. We want a comfortable place that people can use. We want a sense that it's a community, a place where people feel safe there. Justice is for the cops. Justice is for the city attorney or county council that works with you in terms of enforcing codes of conduct or maybe perhaps getting a restraining order against a very problematic or high-risk patron. But our goal most of the time, I think, is peace. The third concept of asking for help kind of goes back to working smart. And in some cultures in the library, employees feel that asking for help somehow suggests they're not very experienced or they're not qualified or they don't know what they're doing, and so that encourages them sometimes not to ask for help, in which case they make mistakes or they don't do the right thing. So I think the part of the cultural shift in your facility, if you see that type of thing, is it's okay to say to staff members in staff meetings and conversations, hey, if you need a supervisor, if you need the person in charge, get them over here. If you think that your intuition says call the cops, we'll back your play. Doing your job versus doing your job safely is another thing I see as well. When the library people tell me in training, Steve, two high school kids with 20-inch biceps are punching each other, and they're about 18 years old, and they play linebacker on the high school football team. Should I go break up the fight? The answer is, of course, certainly not. Shout, stop fighting, stop fighting, stop fighting, leave the library, and then go call the police from a safe place is much different than breaking up a fight. Now, you got two 5-year-olds pulling each other's hair, okay, go separate them. But in certain situations, I see well-meaning staff members put themselves in situations where it's increasingly or exceedingly dangerous for them to try to do their job instead of doing their job safely. Related to that is the idea that the chain of command sometimes exists as an obstacle for employees to do the right thing. If they think, I wonder if I should call the PD or the sheriff, the answer is call the PD or the sheriff. Don't ask your boss for permission if he or she's not in the room. I mean, the model I always use is if the building was on fire, we wouldn't call your boss on vacation in Las Vegas and say, is it okay for me to call the fire department? We ask employees to do the right thing. We ask them to be able to justify why they made certain decisions, and we ask them to do things in terms of using the chain of command when it's necessary, but skipping that when it's not, based on the emergency nature of the situation. And then back to this idea we talked about with the customer service, which is how do we align with patrons? How do we connect with people who we seem to have a better history with than perhaps our colleague? Maybe a boss is a better person to come over and talk to this person than an employee. Maybe you have a better rapport connection with this person as opposed to your colleague. Well, then trade off. Put the best person in front of that patron who's problematic and difficult with the attempt to try to do the best thing for him or her without making the situation worse. I mentioned this before. Sorry. If there are no consequences for this person's behavior, then it's going to continue. And so that's why I like the Code of Conduct, which is a working document. We want consequences for especially severe behaviors. For me, the biggest consequence for employees as a staff member is somebody, as a patron, putting hands on a staff member. So an assaultive way, threatening, grabbing, touching a staff member, for me, means there should be at least a call to the police. If not an arrest, then at least a restraining order, because the message to staff is if we can be touched or punched or hurt by somebody and there are no consequences, then either they don't care about us here or there's going to continue that behavior because there's nothing that's stopping the patron from doing that. And then, of course, we have acting skills, and we go back to the idea of introversion versus extroversion. Introverted employees need to really step on the gas pedal, as I do in my environment, when it comes to stepping out of their introversion shell and acting. I'm going to act assertive, I'm going to act confident, I'm going to act approachable, even though my tendency is to want to just simply stick to my introversion ways. But I really have sometimes to step it up when I'm in a high human contact, transactional, public type of encounter. If you're in the rear with the gear, all the time during the day, and you don't have much human contact except with your colleagues, then maybe you don't need acting skills. But out on the floor, out on the stacks, out in the circulation area, then acting skills are sometimes useful, so you can demonstrate that type of firmness, fairness, confidence, and assertiveness that we want to see. And the last thing is, if it can be measured, it can be managed. And so you can ask the reverse of this as well. We manage what we measure. We can't manage what we don't measure. So the idea of incident reports is really critical for me. When I come into libraries and I say, tell me who the problematic patrons are, they go, well, there's this guy and that guy. And I say, let me see the file. And I say, we don't have a file. We pass down what they do orally from library generation to library generation, which is a mistake. If you want a restraining order, if you want city attorney or county council to do something, if you want the PD to do something, oftentimes they're going to need to see the history of this person's involvement or struggles with the library facility. So security incident reports are a critical part of our work, and if you're not doing them on things like near misses or potential slip and falls or accidents or confrontations, you need to start doing that so we have a good history of what we need to address. Typically, this list of rogues gallery here, these are all things that you certainly know as much or better than I do in terms of who you deal with, the entitled, the angry, the threatening patron, the eccentric patron. I still see the same conversation coming across my desk for the involvement of comfort animals versus service animals. Some libraries have very strict policies about comfort animals not being allowed in the facility, just service dogs. But the problem is we see people buying the little vests and the little certificates online for $200, and of course now their dog is a service animal. And you know, the biggest measure for me, and I feel pretty hard-hearted about this, and so I apologize. I have 8 dogs in my house. I'm really into dogs, so I pay attention to dog behavior. Is when we see a true service dog, when it is inside a library facility, all it looks at is its handler. All it looks at is the person it's supposed to take care of. Comfort dogs, which is, you know, some homeless guy's pit bull or something like that, they're all over the place and they're barking at people and getting after stuff and messing around. The difference between the service dog who's trained is they focus on serving their master, whereas comfort dogs just roam around and get into all kind of mischief. So the animal piece, I think, is an ongoing conversation and a difficult one. In my perfect library world, it would be service animals only and no comfort snakes, rats, weasels, scorpions, nothing like that inside the facility. Unruly kids and their parents, unruly teenagers with or without their parents, again, boundary issues. I see a lot of parents drop off their kids and say, you know, here the library is your jungle gym for the next 5 hours or 6 hours. That's problematic behavior, of course. Stalking behaviors by patrons, especially when they have access to the internet and they use that to research about staff members, is certainly a concern. Sexual behaviors by patrons, either with other patrons or aimed at staff or people that expose themselves, men typically, of course. You got to call the cops on that. Those are escalating behaviors. They typically get worse over time. We got to call the cops. I see a lot of domestic violence come to the library in terms of patrons, sometimes with their offenders. Occasionally we see domestic violence involving an employee. One of the things I've noticed is kind of like hospitals, library people are really good at giving DV information, advocacy information, and shelter information to patrons kind of on the sly to help them sort of address their own concerns, and I like that idea. I'm a big believer in calling the police for things that need consequences. One of the things I see in terms of theft for the library, which sort of dismays me, is oftentimes I'll see the library circulation alarm system set up for the book theft, and of course people tell me, no, we unplugged that years ago, it kept going off, and so we don't use that anymore. And I think sometimes in my perfect library world, we would think about how we address book theft and people that sell our stuff online and steal from it and really impact the and the collections that we have, as opposed to being more vigilant about this stuff. And I think that's sort of a policy shift that we have to make in our mind, which is Target or Walmart, they realize that about 2 to 3% of their product goes out the door for shoplifting. Some of it's done by employees, some of it's done by thieves, of course, and they sort of write that off. Well, I don't always think we have that luxury, and I think we've got to be more vigilant about what people try to steal from the facility. Vigilant from the employee's perspective, which is carefully and using customer service as our approach, is to say to somebody, I noticed you have a DVD in your backpack. I'm happy to put that up at the circulation counter until you're ready to check it out. that kind of approach to things. And then just being more vigilant and really also calling the cops for those situations where people have stolen significant materials. In San Diego, we have a woman who stole about $7,000 worth of books and sold them on eBay and half.com, and she was actually caught and prosecuted and made restitution. Again, no consequences for the behavior. It's going to continue. We talked about the homeless and the mentally ill. In my perfect world, again, you're having advocacy conversations with those groups, public and private sector, coming to the table, and maybe including the police as well. In San Diego, we have something called the Homeless Outreach Team, or the HOT Team, for the PD, and those people can come in and start to come up with actual, real-world, doable solutions to the issues you face with homeless and the mentally ill. Certainly, people coming into your facility that intend to intimidate other folks, like gang members, or scratch their initials or tagger crew scrawls into your building and into your books is a problem. Certainly substance abuse. It's illegal to be high on drugs and alcohol in public. We've got to be vigilant about those people who can't control their use of the goodies. Call the police. It's illegal. Internet hogs and creeps is a distinction I get. Hogs are people that start the 50-yard dash at 10 o'clock in the morning. They come in and they dominate the internet use for most of the day. I'm a big believer in filtering. I'm a big believer in screen cutoff after an hour or 2 hours. I'm a big believer in using a sign-up process for the internet so that we can control that. I feel like sometimes staff feels intimidated by internet hogs and internet creeps, people that bring up inappropriate content with the intention of horrifying little kids or bothering other people. I feel like staff sometimes feels quite intimidated by those guys, and we really need to come up with an approach that typically involves maybe a supervisor or other staff members that are more assertive to help address that. Otherwise, the process just continues, and they just keep bringing up more and more objectionable type stuff. And the last one, stinkers, talkers, smokers, bathers, eaters, and sleepers. Those are all the names of my daughter's favorite punk rock bands. One of the things I see now in smoking is the vape cigarettes, so e-cigarettes. Make sure that's part of your code of conduct as well. Make sure that we've got some staff vigilance in terms of going into restrooms in groups of 2 staff members, 2 together to check on make sure folks aren't misusing the bathrooms. And I guess with the other people, what is the impact on the business? Somebody who has really poor hygiene, what is the impact on the library business? That's a hard conversation to have. Many of you have had to have it with people, and that's why also in conversation with our experts about mentally ill and homeless, we can offer sometimes services or information to those people where they can go to some places and get cleaned up. So I know that these are typically the things that you're seeing across the library landscape. I guess it's time for a reality check on workplace violence. I wrote the first book in the country on workplace violence in '94, a book called Ticking Bombs. I interviewed a double murderer, a guy that killed 2 people at work, and that was my exposure to the subject besides what I saw on the cops. The first reality check for workplace violence is that most workplace violence perpetrators are crooks. And so the typical most common category is 50% is category 1, type 1, crooks. That's typically robbery. Category 2 is about 25% of the problem in this country. Category 3 is about 20% of the problem, and Category 4 is about 5%. Category 3 makes the news, ex-employees with guns. Category 4 makes the news, domestic violence, which crosses over from home to work. But really our focus in this conversation and throughout your working day is typically Category 2, who we provide services to. So I hope that reality check is useful for you, because sometimes people get stuck on the idea that there are homicidal ex-employees roaming the landscape shooting up the place. Those cases happen. They're rare. They're catastrophic, certainly. But really our biggest focus in Category 2 is threatening behavior, verbal threats as opposed to physical threats by people we provide services to. Again, back to my perfect library world, what would the code of conduct look like? You'd be able to see it from a distance away. Putting it only on the website or behind the circulation desk is not useful for me in terms of getting people to understand that we're serious about the code of conduct. I like it when staff and the library leadership has frequent conversations about the code of conduct, and that we're tweaking the language, we're adjusting things like use of iPads and Wi-Fi codes, and use of vape cigarettes or no vape cigarettes in the library, where we're evolving to catch up to what's going on in the world around us. But the language is not written in, like lawyers tend to do it, party the first part hereafter known as opposed to language that a reasonable person could understand and figure out how they're supposed to comply, and also easier for staff to comply as well. So my constant theme for you is to go back and look at the evolution of your code of conduct in your facility. So the e-cigarettes thing I talked about, aggressive panhandling is the concern. Also, we see these religious groups now. They'll stand out in front of the library. You'll see somebody wearing sort of a white jacket or something, and they represent some religious group that's soliciting for money or for the homeless. Have a careful conversation about what their purpose is and whether or not they're allowed to be in your facility. Now, one of the things I see in the third issue, which is interfering with the safe use of the library, is kind of connected back to the homeless, which is their desire to come into the library in sort of groups of 5 or 6 or 10, and they bring in all their worldly goods. They got bags and bags and bags and bags of stuff, and they sit in certain parts of the library and they sort of hold court. They don't do anything related to using the library. They just sit around the common area and they sort of chat and make comments about the world. And my concern for them is does it intimidate other people into not wanting to use the library? Does it intimidate parents about not wanting their kids to go to the library and things like that? And so I always say, what is the impact, again, on the business? And in these situations, I've seen good success where we see an assertive library supervisor, assertive library leader come over to, and what I would say is try to grab the smartest or the most sober or the one that's got seemingly the best connection, kind of the leader of the group of these homeless folks, and to say, look, I got to talk to you over here. You can't continue to do this where you guys come in and hold court and just sit around. You got to leave for periods of time. You got to use the library effectively. You can't bring in all this stuff. It's a fire hazard. It's a litter issue. It's a problem for us. I'm asking you to comply. I'm asking you to use the library in a way that doesn't put other folks at risk or other people wanting to use the facility. And here's what the problem is, sir or ma'am. If you don't do that, I'm going to call the cops. And the cops are going to come in and start checking people for warrants and checking people for sobriety and searching people's stuff, incident to being arrested, and you don't want that. I want you to be able to use the library like everybody else, but when you come in groups of 10 of you and you sit around for 8 hours and you sort of BS and you leave bags of stuff around, we can't have that in the facility. Again, what is your internet policy for the new stuff, which tends to be Wi-Fi and use of people's personal devices, headphone policy. I see this a lot in public facilities and libraries too, which is I'll just play my videos on my tablet or my phone at the top volume, and I don't care if it bugs other folks. Not only bikes and skateboards, but think about your hoverboard policy. These things catch on fire and can be very problematic. If you got kids on hoverboards, you got to have a policy about that. What's our response to vandalism? When do we pull this material? When do we really take a more of a vigilance position on people stealing, especially some of our high dollar items? Again, what is the protocol for using our theft deterrent devices? Unplugging it and sort of giving up is not the approach I'm looking for. Again, using the restrooms in a way which is damaging to them or illegal behavior going on in there. That's why I want the cops to come to your facility on an irregular basis, maybe once or twice a week, and that's part of their patrol route, is to go through and check out the restrooms, make sure everybody's okay. The message we're trying to send to people when the cops come through on an irregular basis is, if you're a bad guy getting ready to do bad things, you got to guess when the cops are here. And the last one, shirts and shoes. What's your policy about that, especially as summer gets closer? Unattended kids is a big issue I see where these parents, alleged parents, drop off their kids. Here's a ham sandwich and a can of Coke, see you in 12 hours, little Johnny. We have 9 Indian casinos in San Diego. A lot of parents use the library as a babysitter while they go to the casino all day. I'm against this. Again, if you have a kid that has a bus pass and a bicycle and a cell phone, I'm not concerned as the kid gets dropped off who's potential to be preyed upon by other kids or preyed upon by adult males. And we can't see everything and watch everybody. If you see kids that are abandoned at the library, I think you have to call either Child Protective Services or the cops in your community and start talking about whether or not this kid is actually safe or not. We had the service animal versus comfort animal conversation. Sleeping, again, what's the impact on the business? Food and drink, some of you invite that stuff in, others not so much. We talked about the electronic devices. We talked a little bit about hygiene. The unattended belongings thing is a big deal in libraries too. People have laptops and iPads and cell phones and purses and backpacks, and they wander off and leave them, and then they blame you, of course, when stuff gets stolen. So that requires staff vigilance, not to watch out for their stuff all the time, but certainly to remind people that you can't see everything and they've got to keep better care of their stuff. And then blocking the aisles and the exits, this is again back to some of our homeless advocacy concerns, some of the challenges we face with that population. So why don't staff get after this stuff? Why do we have such an issue sometimes? Again, if we go back to the introvert versus extrovert staff member, look at all these rationalizations, rationalizing irrational behavior, and pick the ones that you used. I've used a couple of these when I was in the cops. If there's 6 guys on the corner and I was by myself and it was 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm like, maybe I'll come back later. So sometimes we see these rationalizations for staff, either that they say internally to themselves or externally, and as a result they're not doing what we're asking, which is to be firm, fair, consistent, and assertive in terms of enforcing policy. And what I say to staff in training is, don't see this as a you issue, see it as an us issue. What do we do? How do I get help with the people in my facility to address some of the concerns that we just talked about and not rationalize these things away? Here's a model, and I guess I'm a little dyslexic up at the top. It should be introduce, explain, and ask, not introduce, ask, and explain, so I'm a little dyslexic there. This is a model I use all the time in customer service, which is come over, introduce yourself, explain why you came over. I notice your son is on his hoverboard. I notice you're trying to bring a shopping cart inside the facility. I notice that you're not using your headphones. Could I ask you to please do this, this, and this? Introduce, explain, and ask is kind of a low-key model, and I use it all the time in training because I think you can always get tougher from this model, but it starts off pretty calmly and effectively here as a way to do it. And you may have to do it more than once. You may have to explain them to more detail. You may have to ask them more than once. You may have to bring over somebody else to help with this conversation. But this one really works, and it's different from the police model. The police model is ask, tell, make. So I'm going to ask you to leave. So I'm going to tell you to leave, and I'm going to make you leave. And they have a different model completely. But for us, we can use introduce, explain, and ask. And I use this as a training key all the time with staff to make them feel more comfortable. And we do this in role play as well, which is to practice doing some of these things, which I know you know how to do, but we just maybe get a little bit more fine-tuning in terms of some of the things you're dealing with: vape cigarettes, hoverboards, shoes and socks, homeless behavior, etc. Again, we talked about this in the beginning. In my perfect world, we'd have the cops come through on an irregular basis at different times to just check on folks and to make sure the staff is okay, and to wave the flag and to remind people that the police do exist inside the library world, and it's not just an anomaly that they come only when they're called for some kind of extraordinary crime of violence. And so have that conversation as a library leader with the watch commander and ask for extra patrols, especially during busy times. If maybe you have high school or junior high school kids in your facility at certain times, you have sort of a homeless overrun where these folks come in and set up and hold court. And then create an environment where the officers or deputies can come maybe into the back and use the staff restroom, which they want to do. That's all we ever care about, safe restrooms. Create an environment where they can come in and maybe write a report or get a cup of coffee or just say hello. And then be able to provide security incident reports for those situations where the police need to know, or city attorney or county council needs to know, or the library leadership needs to know what's going on, so we have a sense of the history of the situation rather than episodic sort of passed down, well, I think it happened last February, instead of here's the collection of reports about this person and their behavior over a span of time, which makes it easier for us to figure out what to do. Again, in my perfect library world, we start to initiate these conversations with county behavioral health, with county mental health clinicians. We know libraries around the country, San Francisco being one for sure, that have social workers attached to the library, that social services can be more of an outreach possibility for you. We may have conversations with county substance abuse treatment providers who may be able to provide advocacy for some of the people that come into our facility. Certainly adult protective services for elder abuse, which is a big concern as the graying of our population continues. We see a lot of little old ladies and little old men getting dropped off of the library by their alleged caregivers, who then disappear for 10 hours and leave them sitting at the library by themselves. Again, that's abuse. We have CPS as well, Child Protective Services, for those situations where kids are put at risk by being dropped off of the library. It's kind of one big giant daycare. And one of the questions I use sometimes in training is, what would you do if you saw a woman come pick up her kid from a library activity like a children's reading hour or something like that, and the woman was, you know, S-faced drunk? Well, a lot of people in library conversations with me say, well, I'd stop her, I wouldn't let her leave, I'd try to take her keys away, I'd go outside and tell her she can't drive off. Those are all admirable but wrong. The answer is I'd be a professional witness. I'd call the police and give them a description of this woman. I give them her name. Since she signed her kid out, I give the description of her car. And I tell the cops that I believe she's driving drunk with this child. They'll know what to do. They run the plate and they go to the house and look for her. So sometimes I see people in the library world do things which are admirable but sometimes wrong. And the last group in this list here on screen is what can you get in terms of maybe the private sector or grant-funded or faith-based organizations that deal with social services and homeless outreach and homeless advocacy, domestic violence advocacy, child protective service advocacy, those types of groups, where you can bring them to the library table and say, what kind of meetings can we have on a regular basis to move our understanding of these problematic patrons farther along to connect better with you as liaison partners for the situations so that we get some help here and we don't just keep having the same, I don't know what to do about the homeless people conversation day after day. And again, the police may be involved in this as advocacy partners in this as well, but if you look on the screen, I know from your experience that you have a lot of connections with people in your cities and counties. Sometimes what I see for library people is they forget that they work for a city, or they forget that they work for a county because they don't typically get a lot of interaction with cities and counties at the leadership level. The city manager is not calling over to your facility, or the CAO of your county is not calling over to your facility every day to check on you. And so I think they feel like sort of like an island sometimes, where they're disconnected from the city or county. And again, I go back to saying, let's pull out the phone list and figure out some of the organizational responses that we have. Look at the org chart, look at the department directors, and start to have these kinds of conversations. Say, what do we do about the problematic patrons that tend to affect all of us? And again, you know this from your experience, if we can address the 20% that cause the problem, that's 80% of our concern every day. So our Homeland Security friends are always telling us, if you see something, say something. In training, I'm always mentioning to staff, if you see these types of behaviors, these could be casing behaviors, these are bad people getting ready to do bad things, whether it's workplace violence, whether it's gang activity, whether it's theft activity, whether they're planning to do harm to somebody on the staff or harm to do for another patron. These are casing behaviors. Again, we don't ask staff to come in and intervene in these situations typically. You wouldn't go outside the parking lot and say, hey buddy, why are you staring at our building? But to be a professional witness. If you see things, as a reasonable person would say, okay, this has an impact on our business, or could have an impact on our business, I got to call the cops, or I have to tell my boss, or I have to tell the library leadership, or at least I have to share it with a coworker, and we can figure out whether the context of seeing these things in our facility or around our facility is legitimate or not. The guy parked crookedly, watching the building could be a delivery guy from the county, which is perfectly reasonable, or it could be a caser. So we don't ask employees to confront these people, but we ask them to be professional witnesses. And I always say in training, how many of these do you need to see before you'd be concerned? And of course, the answer is 1. So we're in the home stretch here. I want to go back to Customer Service 101. These things I know you know. I oftentimes use this list of 10 as a staff training piece for sometimes staff meetings and things like that. This is called the Code of Quality Service. It was created by my dad, Carl Albrecht. My dad's Carl with a K, same last name, Albrecht, many years ago. He uses this as a training tool in the customer service programs we used to do, and I'm constantly using this as part of my discussion with staff members about what our best practices are for customer services. Greeting people as we see them, giving them your complete attention, not multitasking with phones or computer screens. Number 3 and number 9 are connected to what people typically remember, which is the first 30 seconds and then the last 30 seconds. Playing your part to be real, and 4 and 5 is about not being a bored zombie but being energetic. And again, we go back to the idea that sometimes for introverts they have to fake it. They've got to step on the gas pedal and act. And during the time that they're in front of the public, out on the floor, that they're going to act enthusiastic and act excited about their job, and then go back into introvert mode when you're off the floor. 5, 6, and 7, or 6 and 7 and 8 are connected to each other. We ask people to be the patron's problem solver, use good common sense, don't give away the library store, but bend the rules occasionally as necessary for things about fines or other issues where we can lower the emotional temperature, keep the patron relatively satisfied, provide good service, not harm the library, but continue to move the process forward. And then number 10, I ask staff members to remind themselves a high human contact job is a tough one, and they need to get some good sleep and take care of themselves and be ready to be visible and approachable and aware and focus on good customer service and good security in the library at all times. And the better they are equipped at being ready to do their jobs, the better they're going to do. So as we wrap up, a couple of issues I use in training. One is letting people vent and validating their concerns. People like to vent. They want to tell their story. I use physical movement with people. Sir, let's step over here. Let's walk down over to here. Could you follow me over to here? Please start following my rules is what we're trying to say intuitively. I'm a library professional. Please start following my rules. I use the assertive whisper, which is to lower my voice to try to keep the emotional temperature down. I don't match people scream for scream. We ask people to use space and distance, keeping folks at arm's length, plus a little bit more, especially women. Women oftentimes let men get too close to them. Men don't get too close to other men. It causes confrontations, but they do it with other women, which is either stupid on their part or bad social intelligence, or they're being intentionally aggressive. So I ask ladies working in the library to think about space and distance and to use proxemic barriers like desks and counters sometimes if they feel uncomfortable about people coming too close to them. It could be a cultural issue, could be a body language thing, but oftentimes men use space as dominance. They don't do it with other men, but oftentimes they do it with women. And then read the body language. If we see people that are, talking through their teeth and are red-faced and spitting and angry and clenching their fists, they don't need a hug. They need space and distance. And there's a phrase I always tell people to stop using because it's never worked in the history of mankind, and that's calm down. Stop telling people to calm down. It's never worked. Over the telephone, neutral, friendly, and polite. Be careful over the telephone. You can get a little condescending. You can sigh. You can do things which people sort of read over the phone because all they hear is your voice. Under-promise and over-perform. I'll have that for you too. Get it to them by 10 o'clock in the morning. I'll have that for you tomorrow, sir. Get it for him today. Under-promise and over-perform is a way that we sort of win on the patron's library customer service scorecard. And the last one is set boundaries. If we have people cursing at us, give them one warning. If they do it again, hang up. I tell staff members, don't just write he cursed. Write down specifically what this person said and why you gave them the warning, and then when they do it again, write down specifically what they said and then hang up. We don't set boundaries for that. It encourages more of the same. And the reason we want staff to document the conversation is sometimes these people show up and talk to library leadership and say, I've never been so insulted in all my life. Your employee was very rude to me. They have a little angel wings on, little halo. And in reality, the library director or supervisor can say, I understand you called my employee this, and this. You can't do that if you want to engage with our folks. It's not possible. So boundaries are important, especially over the telephone for certain patrons. So we see these phrases that don't work. You need to calm down is number one. You didn't read the instructions or the directions. Just saying that to people just makes it instantly worse. Think about the things that you heard over the years that typically make the situation instantly worse. I'm really into these phrases here. I have one more that I add to this list, and if you want to add this to your list, especially in training, I think it's useful. Our insurance won't let you do that. Hi, sir. I see your son's trying to bring his bicycle inside the facility. I'm sorry, our insurance won't let you do that. And that's a great phrase because they have to prove you wrong, and it also kind of makes sense intuitively, and it probably is true in a lot of cases. You can't bring your Shetland pony inside the building. You can't have your kid's hoverboard inside here. Our insurance won't let you do that. So a lot of these phrases, things that you say, things that staff say, typically tend to work. We're not trying to manipulate people. We're just trying to manipulate peace instead of justice. The run, hide, fight response for active shooter, this is the post-San Bernardino response, which we've been teaching around the country. When I teach workplace violence, I encourage people to watch the video, Run, Hide, Fight. It's 6 minutes long. You can get it from the YouTube. You can get it from the partnership for the folks that created it, City of Houston, Texas, and the Department of Homeland Security. The video is 6 minutes long. I skip the first minute and a half. Cue it up to the first minute and a half, and then let it run from there. The first minute and a half is some guy that looks like Vin Diesel, bald, sunglasses, black clothing, carrying a shotgun, shooting people. It's fake, it's Hollywood, but if you've had folks involved in critical incidents like I've been, I don't want to see that stuff, and they don't need to see it to prove the point. So the concept of run, hide, fight, pick it up at the minute and a half point, let the video run, and use it as a staff conversation, a staff meeting discussion. Get out of the facility, taking as many patrons and coworkers as you can. Don't fall down and break your ankle, but get out as safely as you can. Hide out inside the facility, break room, restroom, conference room, supervisor's office, training room, someplace we can store the mops or the file folders. Get as many people in there and lock the door. We have seen no cases in the 25 years that I've been doing this, 24 years, where shooters have shot through a door and killed people. If the door's locked, they move on. This shooting at the door lock thing is not in real life. And then the last one is fight back using whatever you have, fire extinguishers, books, pots of hot coffee, whatever you have. These are not trained shooters, and I say this all the time in my discussion. These are not Navy SEALs gone rogue. These are just idiots with guns, and we can stop them and we can fight back collectively. So look at the Run, Hide, Fight video. I think it's very valuable. I show the thing constantly. I think it's a very good measured response as opposed to others that I've seen that are not so good, that are kind of glorify violence. But the 6-minute Run, Hide, Fight video, just pick it up at the 1.5-minute point and let it run. Look at the business impact of what the person's doing. How do they hurt the business? Update your code of conduct. Teach staff to stay firm, fair, consistent, and the most important one is assertive. Refer to our patrons as not necessarily difficult, but challenging, because difficult has kind of a connotation to it, but challenging means challenging. Work on your relationships, public and private sector, groups that address homelessness, address mental health, address substance abuse. Improve your relationships with these agencies. Improve your relationships with the police department. Come up with some common customer service responses to behavior problems and patron issues that the staff can agree upon is useful. This is what we typically do in these situations. Document what's going on in your facility with security incident reports so we know what to measure and we know what to fix. I see a lot of success with civil stay-away orders that are verbal. You're out for the day. You can't come back for a week. You can't come back for 30 days. And I've seen these work, especially with homeless people. It's amazing to me that it does. Mrs. Jones, can I come back in 4 more days? All right, I'll see you in 4 days. 3 more days before I can come in, right? It's amazing to me how these work. But verbal stay-away orders tend to work for a certain population, especially for the homeless. Lighter touch, you can always get tougher. Start with a lighter touch first, maybe a little bit of humor. You can always read the policy manual to them later on, read the code of conduct to them later on, but a little bit lighter touch in the beginning tends to make things easier for people to go along with. Don't forget, as you well know, people hate being embarrassed. They hate being told what to do, especially by people younger than them. That's why I whisper sometimes, so I don't embarrass them in front of other people. But oftentimes, if just a little bit of a lighter touch makes a big difference. And then the last one is to be courageous. So Joe, it's back over to you.
All right, thank you very much, Steve. A lot covered in an hour, to be sure, so we'll give you a moment to take a breath. We're almost at 11. I'm sensitive to our time, but we'll try to do just maybe 1, 2 at most questions. Steve, going back to what you've said about contacting the police, for library staff to contact the police, you know, going back to my days in working in public libraries and talking to public libraries now, it seems that there are different kind of systems set up for doing that. And I realize that this might depend on, you know, the local law enforcement and the things that libraries have set up. But I can speak from experience about when there was a situation that I maybe felt as the one in charge of the building that day, I was wanting to call the police. We would have, you know, a non-emergency number we could call, and then of course there was 911. I know from my perspective, I never really wanted to have to decide whether a situation was an emergency or not. I was always inclined to dial 911 to get somebody there, and then they can kind of assess it. But I know libraries that really rely on that non-emergency police number. So do you have any perspective on just best practices for when you need to feel like you want to contact police?
That's a great question. I think if you have any concerns about escalation towards the crimes of violence or anything towards somebody getting hurt, you call 911. If it's something where the police need to come by and have a conversation with somebody, it's not necessarily an emergency or dangerous, you could call the non-emergency number. But I think your intuition kind of tells you what to do, and also if you have a concern that it could escalate to 911, start with 911. And they know the difference in terms of how they staff out the calls for the cops. They know how to dispatch it based on the urgency. But if you have any kind of concerns at all, I think you go 911. Use the non-emergency one for those issues where they may just need to come by and do certain things that don't involve any potential for violence.
Gotcha. Very good. Okay, well it is a minute or two after 11, so we will wrap up. Steve, I want to thank you again for kind of redoing this webinar for us. Got to see your slides and everything. Reminder to you folks that this has been recorded, so if you have staff members, other management team members that maybe couldn't be part of this webinar or even the one last time, this will be up on the CE Archives page later this week. Steve, thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Joe, and thanks for the support of my program.
You bet. All right, everyone, enjoy the rest of your day and your week.